Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson analyzes the wheat markets. Bob Wright looks at insect issues in soybeans and corn. Tamra Jackson-Ziems shows how to scout for nematodes. Kevin Corris outlines seedling issues due to cool, wet conditions. And Bruce Anderson discusses maximizing this year's forage crop. With some areas of the state receiving more than 4 inches of rain last week, the latest UNL drought monitor shows continued easing, especially in southeast Nebraska. Only 3% of Nebraska still remains in the worst category of drought, compared to 75% at the beginning of April. The 6% of the state that is in no drought classification is also the most since the end of last June. Frayne Olson is our marketing analyst this week. The wheat industry recently faced an unusual shakeup when an Oregon farmer who sprayed his fallow wheat field recognized some wheat had survived. After testing, scientists discovered the wheat was glyphosate tolerant from a Monsanto line that was in testing nearly a decade ago. That shook international buyers and also a Kansas farmer who is now suing Monsanto for gross negligence. We discussed the issue with Frayne Thursday morning, but we began by looking at the current condition of winter wheat across the country.
Well, we get, again, every week we get crop condition updates. The winter wheat progress. The winter wheat conditions really haven't changed a lot throughout the rest of the growing season. They went into last fall in pretty tough shape in a lot of areas. They broke dormancy, and not much change in overall ratings. And even though we've been seeing some rain showers in the eastern portion of the winter wheat belt, the west still looks like it's in pretty tough shape. So I know the combines will start rolling as we get into the Texas and Oklahoma winter wheat harvest soon. We'll be watching the yield reports very, very closely, and we'll just see what happens.
But it looks, Frayne, like you were correct a few months ago when I said ignorantly, I don't understand why this crop just isn't running away in the markets, and it never really did, right?
No, it really hasn't. And there's a couple things that have developed. Internationally, we've talked about it before. There were some areas that we were watching fairly closely to see if there were some problems developing internationally. And as we look around the world at the world wheat situation, most of those areas that we were concerned about, at least temporarily, have been mitigated. They've been improved. So if you look into Europe, they've been having somewhat drier and cooler weather, which is good for small grain development. You look into the Black Sea region, and the areas that were a little bit on the wet side have been drying up. Those areas that were a bit on the dry side have been getting some rain showers. And Australia is starting to make some progress on their winter wheat seedings.
So that almost keeps a lid on what the potential for U.S. exports could be.
Yep. So if you look around worldwide, in the world of wheat, the United States is really the one that's having the problems right now.
One of the problems is the GMO scare in Oregon. That flared up last week. Is there a possibility that that has legs, that it could run, and international buyers are still concerned about this in a few weeks?
Well, we've already seen some international buyers requesting test kits to find out, have some of the shipments that they've already received contain some GMO material. The European Union has done that, Japan, Korea, as well as Taiwan. Now, to date, none of them have found any traces in the shipments that have been made thus far. They've also done more extensive testing within the seed supply in the Oregon area where the GM wheat was first found, to see, is this more endemic? Is this something that's a bit wider spread? And again, as of today, we haven't found any other traces. So we'll have to wait to see how this plays out. There are some of the international buyers, in particular Japan and Korea, that are not tendering for U.S. grain shipments, especially for the white winter wheat, which was where the GM products were found. So short term, I think everybody's being very, very cautious, trying to figure out the extent of the problem. Longer term, we're just going to have to wait to see.
What's your opinion on where the market goes from here? Does it mainly run on harvest news from now on?
I think it'll be a combination of harvest news and some of the early yield reports that are coming out. And again, they're going to be very mixed. There's going to be part of the winter wheat country that has some very good yields and quality potential. There's going to be areas that do have some problems. The other thing is we're still closely tied to the corn market. Both domestically as internationally, the corn market is still pushing the wheat prices around. Wheat has really not been able to separate itself from the corn market yet, so they are going to be tied together as we move forward.
Spring wheat planting in North Dakota is facing a similar struggle to Nebraska. North Dakota planters are usually 90% complete with their spring wheat crop at this point in the season, but they're only 2/3 finished this year. With a crop insurance deadline at the end of May, those who aren't finished now face reduced coverage if they decide to continue. Next week, we'll look at cattle markets with Mike Briggs. Hard rain fell in large amounts over portions of Nebraska late last week. Replanting may be necessary in fields, and some may have also lost nitrogen. We asked UNL Extension soil scientist Charles Shapiro if there's a chance precipitation may have caused nitrogen to leach.
Definitely. The more water that is infiltrated into the soil, the more possibility of leaching. It all depends on how much water is already in the soil and then the texture, which will determine how many inches per foot the soil can hold.
What's your recommendation then to a farmer?
If they have only had a couple of inches of rain and they have fine textured soils, they probably would be okay, especially if they started out very dry. But on sandy soils and soils that have taken in 4 to 6 inches of rain, where they've had a lot of nitrogen put out before that, there is a good possibility that some of that N has moved down in the profile.
Charles says if corn looks yellow, that would indicate plants haven't reached nitrogen yet. He says you can take a soil sample down to 2 feet to find nitrogen. If nitrogen is beyond 2 feet, you may want to think about putting more on. But if it's within the 1 foot range, the corn will probably soon reach it. Inspired by the pace of corn planting, 2013 U.S. soybean planting is the slowest since 1996. 57% of the bean crop is now in the ground across the country, but Nebraska is well ahead of the national average, with 81% of its soybeans planted. Because the state's farmers had 1/3 of their seed in the ground 2 weeks ago, emergence is varied by a matter of weeks. We talked with Bob Wright Wednesday about how those first soybeans up may be more susceptible to bean leaf beetle. As far as corn pests, Bob says common stalk borers should now be on the grower's radar as the insect moves from the field's edges into the crop.
Well, it has sort of an unusual life cycle. The moths lay their eggs in the fall, and they're particularly if you have brome grass waterways or weedy areas on the edges of the fields like ragweed or other broadleaf weeds, they're attracted to that type of vegetation to lay eggs in the fall. So the insect overwinters in the egg stage and then hatches out in the spring. And typically it starts out feeding on small stem grasses like brome grass. And then as the caterpillar gets too big, it can't fit in the brome grass anymore, and it starts migrating, looking for other plants, and that's when it migrates into corn. And we're getting about the time now where the caterpillars are getting large enough so that they will start migrating out of brome into corn. And so we're coming up to the time where people need to start scouting their corn, especially if you've had problems with stalk borers before, to see if you might have a treatable problem right now.
What are you looking for, and what areas of the field are you looking at?
Well, typically, again, if you have a brome grass borders, typically they're on the field edges most commonly and migrate into the field. There can be some leaf feeding on whorl stage corn, or if they enter the plant at the growing point, they can kill a plant and kill the growing point, so you have dead leaves in the whorl. That would be a sign that stalk borers are maybe there. And you need to pull up the plant and dissect it and see what's inside. But now would be the time to start checking for that. And if there's enough injury on the border, you may want to treat.
What's the treatment recommendation?
Well, it's there are various insecticides, pyrethroid insecticides, insecticides containing chlorpyrifos would be good products. The actual level varies a lot with the plant growth stage, as well as the amount of injured plants and the value of the crop and the treatment cost. And we have that information on the Crop Watch website.
We have a wide variation of soybeans, my guess is, across the state that are maybe some not even planted and the others that are probably emerged already. Problems with bean leaf beetles, do you expect?
Well, we've generally had lower populations of bean leaf beetles since we've been using the neonicotinoid seed treatments on soybeans, which are systemic and help reduce early season populations, but there's always a chance that individual fields would be damaged. And the bean leaf beetles emerge way before soybeans are, and they feed on alfalfa and other legumes, but they're looking for soybeans. So the first emerging fields typically get a concentration of beetles from the area. So certainly you should check your first emerging fields, see if there are bean leaf beetle problems, and treat if needed.
What's the damage that you're looking for?
Basically, they feed on the cotyledon leaf and the early emerging leaves. And if you have 1 to 2 beetles per plant on an average for the cotyledon stage and 2 to 3 beetles per plant on average with 1 leaf stage, that's a treatable level. But this is a field average of 1 to 2 per plant or 2 to 3. It's not just an individual plant that has 2 beetles.
This is an insect that may come a few times during the season. It's, I believe, more detrimental, correct me if I'm wrong, when the pod is actually on the plant itself. So do early indications of insect populations now indicate anything towards the future?
No, not really. A lot depends on the environmental conditions this summer, how much the populations will build up, and also the beetles can move around from field to field. But definitely the late season populations are the ones that cause the most economic damage because they can feed on the pods directly and damaging developing seed in the pods. So that's something to watch for later in the season.
Bob's recent article on common stalk borer is available on the Crop Watch website. We'll also link to it for more information through the Market Journal homepage. Nebraska's corn crop continues to emerge. The latest USDA report showed 84% was above the ground. Farmers may now be thinking about sampling for nematodes. While sandy soils need to be sampled fairly quickly, most other soils can be probed up to the V6 growth stage on corn and still present good data. UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems explains how nematodes affect corn and methods producers can use to sample their fields.
Plant parasitic nematodes cause disease in corn and occur in every single field that we have in the United States. And so it's important to understand the symptoms that they cause and the types of disease that you might see. And so the severity and the type of symptoms are going to vary by the nematode, and there's over a dozen different species of nematodes that can cause disease in corn. The symptoms that they cause is going to depend on which species you have out there, and it's also common to have multiple species in every field. And so the types of symptoms that you might see in corn above ground might be stunted or yellow plants in the field. Some of those areas might actually be in patches out in the field that are randomly scattered around. You may also observe symptoms on the roots, and it's important to look at the roots for clues as to what's going on. Root damage may look like stubby roots, or you might see discoloration or dead root tips that can be an indication of some types of nematodes. And so you won't know until you submit a sample whether or not the actual cause of a problem is nematodes. And so here's a few tips to help you collect and submit samples for corn nematode analysis. First of all, collect samples from the root zone. If the field is sandy, it's important that you sample those fields early in the growing season by the 5th leaf stage when the plants are still small. Any other textured field, soil textured field, heavier soils, can be sampled pretty much any time. A convenient time might be to wait until after harvest when you're collecting soil samples for soil analysis for nitrogen and other nutrients. When collecting samples, please place them in sealable plastic bags. Handle them very gently because we need nematodes alive in the laboratory to give you good, accurate results. Some laboratories are going to require that you also submit root samples or root balls in addition to the soil. And so be sure to contact the lab that you're going to submit samples to confirm what type of sample that they would like and whether or not they can receive samples from out of state if you're going to send them from out of state. Also, we want to recommend handling these samples very gently, and so that includes making sure they're not exposed to temperature extremes. These samples cannot be allowed to get hot or too cold, such as freezing, because that'll certainly compromise the quality of the sample. Be sure when sampling to provide at least 2 cups of soil in the plastic bag and package it very well. Be sure to also mail the sample very quickly, as rapid as you can, and early in the week to prevent it from sitting in a warehouse or in a truck over the weekend. So be sure and contact your local extension office if you need assistance in doing this, and also contact a university diagnostic lab if you're going to submit a sample.
On the same front, Kevin Corris talked with us Wednesday about seedling issues farmers may be noticing in their corn and soybean fields. Phytophthora and Rhizoctonia can affect soybeans, but Pythium can impact both. And Kevin says 2013 has provided conditions conducive to damage.
We had the perfect weather conditions this spring for Pythium. We had a lot of soil moisture, and our soil temperatures have been cool for quite a long time. So this has slowed the germination of our corn and our soybeans, and it's just kind of the right kind of soil conditions that Pythium need to cause infection.
That's essentially what Pythium does, it just slows it down?
No, the temperature is the result, is what slows the germination down. And so the seedling sits in the soil for a longer period of time. And if soils are wet or saturated, a lot of the leachate that's produced when these seedlings are germinating gets into that water, and it stimulates germination by these fungal spores. And so the fungal spores have a longer time to sit there and cause infection.
What are some things that people should be looking for, some signs that they might have?
They're going to see stunted and wilted plants if they've come up. They're also going to see skips in their rows. They're going to see areas where the plants have not germinated through the soil line at all. So they're going to want to dig down and find that seedling. And they can look for some of the symptoms, or of course send it in for diagnosis.
You recommend sending it in even if a producer doesn't feel like it's necessary to replant? Do you still recommend sending it in? I
mean, if someone wants a history of what's going on in their field, in terms of management recommendations for the following spring, I would suggest a diagnosis. There are a couple active ingredients for seed treatments that are available that protect against Pythium, metalaxyl and mefenoxam. So if they do have the option of getting seeds coated in that for next year, that might provide some protection.
Not something they would have to do if they decided to replant?
If someone has some stand loss and they want to replant this year, the soil temperatures might be warm enough by the time they get back in there and plant to where we're not going to see as much Pythium. It's not going to be as big of a problem. So they might not need to select for those chemicals this year.
Problems in both corn and soybeans with that. Have you seen a lot of that this year, or at least some of it?
Most of what's coming in is caused by Pythium. I haven't seen any of the major other players. I haven't seen Phytophthora and soybean, or Fusarium or Rhizoctonia yet this year.
What would those look like if they were to exist?
Pythium and Phytophthora are very difficult to distinguish between. I would recommend sending in a sample, of course, if you're concerned about both. Very difficult to distinguish just by symptoms alone. Rhizoctonia is unique, where it only infects the seedling at the soil line. So right where the soil line touches that stem of the plant, you will see a lesion. And the lesion might work its way up and down a little bit, but you'll see the initial infection start right at the soil line with Rhizoctonia.
In all of these, what's optimum soil, what's the best possible sample that you can get in order to ensure optimum results?
Well, I prefer the whole entire seedling. If you can take 2 or 3 or 4 different samples, that's great. If you can include a healthy plant for comparison, that's also fantastic. And the best place to find this pathogen is kind of in the zone from where the plants are affected to where they're healthy. In that transition zone is the best place to sample to ensure that we find the fungus.
If you decide to take samples in your corn or soybean fields, you can send them to the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab or take them to your local extension office. The Nebraska Department of Ag has confirmed 12 cases of equine infectious anemia, or EIA, in a northwest Nebraska horse herd. The disease is blood-borne, transmitted typically by insects, but it can also move from horse to horse through needles. State veterinarian Dennis Hughes says there's no treatment options, and EIA is usually fatal. The disease only affects horses, mules, and donkeys. Nebraska's Department of Ag is encouraging horse owners to take biosecurity precautions to prevent the risk of EIA, including reducing biting insects and using only 1 needle per horse. Last year's drought has triggered interest in new rural water projects, particularly those in northeast Nebraska. In the June Nebraska Farmer, you can learn how the Lower Elkhorn Natural Resources District is addressing domestic water concerns, including water shortages and water quality issues. The NRD already has 2 rural water districts, near Oakland and near Wausau and Coleridge. Now residents near Madison are petitioning the NRD's Board of Directors to study the need for a rural water district there. You can learn more about the possible new project in June's Nebraska Farmer. Growers have begun their first cuttings of alfalfa according to the latest USDA state report. While moisture may be hampering that harvest, the precipitation is much needed for grazing land. 58% of Nebraska's pasture and rangeland is still rated poor or very poor, but that's a 7% improvement from a week ago. We asked Bruce Anderson Wednesday how recent rains are affecting grass growth.
Well, they've really made a lot of pastures look much better than maybe we would have expected as of a month or so ago. Certainly in the eastern part of the state, where a lot of areas have had 6-8 inches or more of rain since the early part of May, those cool season pastures have really flourished and maybe even given more growth than what we really wanted to see at this point, with a lot of brome starting to head out at this time. As we move further west, of course, we're getting into areas that have had more drought stress on them. So their ability to recover is a little bit lessened, and the amount of moisture that they've had is not quite as great. The cool temperatures have not done them a whole lot of good either, but now with some moisture, some warmer summer temperatures coming on, we're starting to see some of those hills start to green up, and hopefully we get a little bit more moisture to keep them going for the summer.
Does it give you a little more confidence, at least based off of where you were at the beginning of the season?
I've got a little bit more confidence there, but I think that knowing what forecasts can be like and how a Nebraska summer can change on a dime so quickly, we've still got to be pretty conservative and not overly expect that things are going to be turned around overnight with just a little rain.
Moving to a few other avenues, alfalfa, are you recommending any differences in cutting strategies for the summer?
Well, I think a lot of people have already noted that their alfalfa hasn't developed as rapidly as what we normally would see. Usually a lot of alfalfa is cut even by Memorial Day, and now we're well past that, and we still don't have a lot of alfalfa harvested. The cool temperatures, some of the rainy conditions have held off on the alfalfa cutting. Also, a lot of the alfalfa hasn't bloomed like it might normally do so. And so I think producers need to be taking a look at their alfalfa to see if any new growth is occurring at the base of the plants, which would be actually their second growth then, and an indication that their alfalfa is ready to cut, even if there isn't a bloom on those plants as yet.
But you're not recommending holding off any longer than normal necessarily?
I don't think at this point we need to hold off any longer than what we normally might. As soon as that alfalfa is ready, it'd be good to get that harvest there so that the next growth can come on whenever there's enough moisture to support it.
You expect to see any major changes in protein levels as you go from the first cutting to the second to perhaps the third?
I don't see really likelihood of much change from what we normally have, and so I think producers can kind of at least anticipate that the quality of their hay ought to be pretty normal, and that moisture is going to be the primary determinant as to what kind of quantity we end up with.
Have you heard of any major disease issues in alfalfa?
No, surprisingly, even with the moisture that a lot of folks have had, we haven't seen a whole lot of disease in most areas, so that's been fortunate, and hopefully that'll continue for the rest of the year.
Now with his weekly weather forecast, here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again, it's time for the weekly forecast. A little bit drier conditions this past 7 days compared to the previous 7 days, although we did see some areas that did receive some localized moderate precipitation. Most areas failed to receive more than an inch of moisture this past week, and so we did see a little bit of a drying pattern starting to develop, particularly as we headed into southwestern Nebraska, which has been problematic, and it is probably the driest, one of the driest areas of the state is basically on the northern end of a very dry pattern that exists all the way down through the western high plains. Now, as we go forward in time, the one thing that we've been looking at recently has been this moderate temperature trend that has been a little bit of a concern, especially with the planting delay issues. It does appear, at least from the models that I'm looking at, that we are going to start to see an abrupt movement toward very warm conditions, particularly as we get into the middle of the month, as a very large dome of high pressure starts to build its way across the southern plains. Would not be surprised that we'll start to see temperatures consistently in the upper 90s to low 100s, basically from central Kansas southward, and some of that may encroach into Nebraska. So let's take a look at the upper air models to see if any of that's in store for us. And the one thing I'll show you today is that we do have a northwest flow aloft. We do have that warm front that's coming through that has been responsible for some of the scattered precipitation. And as that warm air moves into our region, we'll start pushing the heavier precipitation over some of the very soggy areas of Iowa and points to the east. Now as we go into tomorrow, you can really start to see this ridge building in, so some very warm conditions in the southern plains. We will see some systems moving along the periphery of this ridge, so we can't rule out scattered thunderstorm activity. It'll be fairly isolated in nature. And then as we get into Monday, we'll start to see that ridge start to center itself across the south central United States. Most of the primary activity will be to our north. But again, we can't rule out a scattered thunderstorm as we sit right at the periphery of this ridge, and we do tend to see some of these ridge riders moving along the edge of that ridge. Now as we go into Tuesday, we start to see that ridge sags a little bit in response to a trough trying to build into the Pacific Northwest, and there'll be some energy moving out of the southwest that may generate some scattered shower and activity across western Nebraska. But as we get into Wednesday, this looks to be where the energy kind of lays across South Dakota and maybe influencing much of northern Nebraska with some widespread shower and thunderstorm activity, lesser as you get toward the Nebraska border with Kansas. Now as we go into Thursday, we'll start to see that ridge rebuilding, and again we're right on the periphery of that ridge, so we may see some active weather again, but it'll be more isolated in nature. By the time we get to Friday, the ridge really starts to build into the south central Rockies, and the cold air remains to our north. So in terms of the temperature forecast, my models that I'm using are looking at some very warm temperatures during the early part of the week as that ridge builds in, and then we'll start to see a slight cool down, at least in eastern Nebraska. The best chances for widespread moisture across the state would be in the Tuesday, Wednesday time frame, but we will have the isolated thunderstorm activity to deal with. Now in terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, we start to see the warm air building in across much of the Intermountain region, and as we look at the precipitation, with that ridge building in, we're starting to see the drier weather moving into our region.
Thanks, Al. Our interviews with Frayne Olson, Bob Wright, Tamra Jackson-Ziems, Kevin Corris, and Bruce Anderson are available on the Market Journal website and on the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our marketing analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.